Here she comes, and there she blows. Hurricane Isabel. Full team coverage tonight of the still dangerous storm, where it is heading and what it may do. Was Saddam involved in 9/11? President Bush answered that question today. You'll hear what he said. It's getting ugly in the Kobe Bryant case. The defense's pretrial no-holds-barred attack on his accuser. And something you'll really want to see. We'll show you what it's like to be caught in the powerful winds of a hurricane.
This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. Hurricane Isabel is about 18 hours or less from the U.S. mid-Atlantic mainland. It is now expected to come across the Outer Banks of North Carolina with top winds of around 100 miles an hour and then dissipate some rapidly. Rising water, flooding, heavy rain, and some spin-off tornadoes may occur in a wide area as this especially big storm moves deep inland. This still dangerous hurricane could directly affect 50 million people before it's over. Here's what the storm looks like from outer space. The bulk of it is about 300 miles away from Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, and moving toward it at 14 miles an hour. Top steady winds are 105 miles an hour, gusts higher. A slight increase in wind strength is possible. Now, the area in red just outside Isabel's eye is the hurricane's most intense wind and rain. Hurricane warnings are up tonight from North Carolina to Virginia. A wider area has lesser but still important alerts. The threat of flooding from up to a foot of rain extends far inland and up into the northeast. And if Isabel takes a last-minute turn to the right, major cities could take a bad hit. Repeating for emphasis, the hurricane is expected to begin hitting the barrier islands of North Carolina tomorrow. We have CBS News correspondents deployed throughout the hurricane zone. Our coverage begins with Lee Cowan on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Lee?
Hi, Dan. We're starting to feel now just the outer rim of Isabel. We've got gusts here, winds pretty steady between 30 and 40 miles an hour. Some rain bands have come through as well. This is just the leading edge of a storm that could bring torrential downpours and hurricane-force winds that could batter this coastline for an unbelievable 12 long hours.
Tonight, the Outer Banks of North Carolina are a gray and eerie ghost town. There are no roads into the coast anymore, only roads leading out. With Isabel's heavy surf pounding the beaches, emergency crews are going door to door to check for those who have yet to flee.
I'll be out of here probably by 5:30.
After making landfall, Isabel is expected to race across Virginia and then turn north, soaking everything from Pennsylvania to New York.
We're really concerned with the inland freshwater flooding. We'll likely see 6 to 10 inches of storm total precipitation along the path of the hurricane.
In Delaware, schools are closed and the National Guard is on standby. In Washington, D.C., congressional offices on Capitol Hill are battening down the hatches, and officials are planning to shut down all bus and subway traffic. In Pennsylvania, cleanup crews are racing to repair damage from a week's worth of rain before Isabel tops it off with yet another watery blow. But it's North Carolina's Outer Banks that are bracing for the first and perhaps hardest punch. An island chain, the Outer Banks are surrounded by water. Isabel will hit at high tide, shoving both the ocean water and the water in 2 nearby sounds, all in one direction. But as the eye passes over, the wind direction changes, and all that water comes rushing right back.
That's when we experience the sound side flooding.
So you get hit twice.
Relatively speaking, yes.
And that is precisely why the mandatory evacuations here have been in place for the last 48 hours. Tonight, most seem to have heeded that warning. Dan?
Lee Cowan reporting live in North Carolina. Be careful out there. We take you now about 100 miles to the south to Atlantic Beach near Morehead City, North Carolina. CBS's Cynthia Bowers is there. Cynthia?
Dan, this island is home to about 6,000 people, and with forecasts calling for this area to bear the brunt of Isabel, most have packed up and gotten off. If Isabel stays on course, the eye of the storm could pass right over this beachfront community, pounding it with its strongest winds, still 105 miles an hour. In just a half hour, all access to this island will be cut off, and local officials have told the 300 or so who have chosen to remain behind that they are on their own. Dan?
Reporting live from Atlantic Beach, North Carolina, Cynthia Bowers. Even as the hurricane blows itself out, torrential rain is probable long after the strongest wind is gone. That's why there's great fear of flooding in places where this has happened before, such as Princeville, North Carolina. Mark Strassman is there tonight. Mark?
Dan, this part of North Carolina is expecting up to 10 inches of rain. That makes people here nervous because just 4 years ago today, the bridge behind me was hidden under 40 feet of floodwater. It was Hurricane Floyd. In Princeville, Isabel reminds them of Floyd. Inland flooding destroyed 75% of the town's homes and most of its infrastructure. Princeville rebuilt, but no one wants to repeat that misery. As one resident told me today, everybody here has a tank full of gas and a bag packed, just in case. Dan?
In Princeville, North Carolina, Mark Strassman, thanks. The crude art, at best imprecise science of hurricane forecasting can now give more advance warning to people potentially in the path of a hurricane that a storm is coming. Tonight, that would include the people in Virginia Beach, Virginia. But CBS's Bob Orr reports scientists still can't predict how bad a storm will be when it gets there. They are sometimes wrong about strength and direction.
As Isabel churned through the Atlantic, it was a monster.
This is a very dangerous hurricane right now.
With devastating 160-mile-per-hour winds.
Here's Isabel, Category 5 still.
Taking aim at the East Coast.
We may see 40-foot seas.
But Isabel, a potentially cataclysmic Category 5 storm just 6 days ago, began to lose its punch. Forecasters who had warned of widespread destruction on Monday downgraded the hurricane to a Category 3. And tomorrow, Isabel will likely come ashore as a Category 2, with winds of 110 miles per hour or less.
There's a psychological problem here because since this was a Category 5 and now it's a Category 2, people use the word weakened. But if
meteorologist Brian Norcross, a CBS hurricane analyst, says Isabel is still dangerous. Hurricane experts, he says, have accurately tracked Isabel and its diminishing strength. But forecasters don't have the scientific tools necessary to precisely predict days in advance how strong the storm will be at landfall.
The factors in the atmosphere that cause a hurricane to go up or down and be a Category 5 or a 4 or a 2 or a 1 are very, very slight, tiny influences, and we just can't forecast them with the state of the technology now.
Forecasters have missed before, and sometimes with deadly consequences. Andrew, the most devastating hurricane in U.S. history, grew from a Category 1 to a 5 in just 2 days. And just this summer, Hurricane Claudette strengthened overnight to wallop Texas.
Forecasters concede if they're going to err, it must be on the side of caution. While they try their best to be as accurate as possible, they say they would simply rather overstate the danger than run the risk that somebody takes a storm like Isabel too lightly. Dan?
In threatened Virginia Beach, Virginia, Bob Orr. Turning now to the ongoing war in Iraq, which President Bush has often linked to the war on terror worldwide, which began with the 9/11 attacks. A new CBS News poll indicates Americans' enthusiasm for the Iraq war is slipping at least some, and as John Roberts reports, the president is now trying to blunt criticism that he, his vice president, and others in his administration overstated their case against Saddam Hussein.
President Bush today moved to silence critics who claim he's blurring the lines between Iraq and 9/11. Most recently on Sunday, when his vice president described Iraq as the, quote, geographic base for the terrorists who attacked America.
We've had no evidence that Saddam Hussein was involved with the September the 11th. Now, what the vice president said was that he has been involved with al-Qaeda.
Critics charged the White House was making the connection to build support for a costly occupation, one a new CBS News poll finds Americans increasingly skeptical about. Fully 2/3 say the U.S. should not spend the $87 billion President Bush today asked Congress for on Iraq. What's more, the majority of Americans think the administration has no plan to rebuild there. And more people now say the war wasn't worth it than say it was. The sagging poll numbers came on the same day new questions were raised about the justification for war. Former Chief Weapons Inspector Hans Blix told an Australian radio station he now thinks Iraq destroyed all of its weapons of mass destruction 12 years ago. If true, then the burdens of a costly occupation will weigh even more heavily on the president, says former Ambassador Joe Wilson, who served in Iraq under the first President Bush.
The president's credibility depends on the success both of our finding evidence of weapons of mass mass destruction or their programs, but more importantly, whether we succeed in this occupation phase, and we're not succeeding.
Our poll also found that nearly 2/3 of Americans would happily hand over substantial control over Iraq's future to UN countries willing to put up reconstruction costs, a notion President Bush has so far rejected. Dan?
Live from the White House, John Roberts. You may want to note that the Bush administration says that the occupation of Iraq is succeeding. In Iraq today, the interim governing council, handpicked by American administrators, called on the U.S. to quickly give it real power to run the country. As CBS's David Hawkins reports, this coincided with the release of a purported new audio tape from Saddam Hussein, again urging Iraqis to drive out the Americans.
His voice might not be strong, but the message is clear, and Iraqis are listening. Defense Department officials now warn the insurgency in Iraq is growing, not only because Saddam continues to call for attacks, but because of what American soldiers are doing. Iraqis are becoming more and more hostile in reaction to rough treatment.
Get your ass down! I ain't telling nobody again.
And the deaths of hundreds of Iraqis at the hands of U.S. soldiers. America's top general in Baghdad admits a culture clash is causing problems. He told the London Times today, "We've seen that when we killed an innocent civilian based on their values, their culture, they would seek revenge." U.S. officials in Washington and here in Baghdad maintain the attacks on American soldiers are the work of Saddam loyalists and a few foreign fighters. Dead Enders, they call them. But the new intelligence suggests that even ordinary Iraqis are a threat that could get worse over time. In two separate recent interviews with CBS News, men who claim they've killed U.S. soldiers say, "This is a holy war against the Americans. We must drive them out." And that they're fighting for Allah, not Saddam. Saddam Hussein and Iraq's religious militants were enemies before, but now he's preaching to the choir. David Hawkins, CBS News, Baghdad.
A judge in Spain today issued an indictment against Osama bin Laden and 34 alleged followers, including a man who said he was a reporter for the Al Jazeera television network, charging them with terrorism, including the September 11th attacks on America. The Spanish judge said that prior to 9/11, Al-Qaeda used Spain as, quote, a base for arresting, preparation, indoctrinating, support, and financing of terrorism. Coming up next here on the CBS Evening News, he's out. Why the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange is throwing in the towel. And now there are 10. As expected, there was a long roll-up. Retired U.S. Army General and former NATO Commander Wesley Clark formally announced today he is joining the race for the Democratic presidential nomination. Clark is 58 years old. He unloaded on President Bush's economic policies, saying they cost more jobs, quote, than our economy has the energy to create. The chairman of the New York Stock Exchange resigned tonight. Richard Grasso has been under increasing pressure to step down in a controversy over how much the exchange was paying him, something in the neighborhood of $200 million, who approved that amount, and the ethics or lack of same involved. CBS's Anthony Mason has more about this late-breaking story.
As chairman of the New York Stock Exchange, Dick Grasso made himself a symbol of American business and an enforcer of corporate fairness. But suddenly his stock went into free fall. First, the exchange revealed its chairman was paid $140 million.
I'm very proud to say that I've been very well compensated.
Last week, the board said there was more.
Dick is entitled to receive an additional $48 million.
Under pressure, Grasso gave up the $48 million.
I think it's important for this business to get back to business, and that very simply is why I've done what I've done.
But he was unable to outrun the outrage. Is Wall Street shocked by this number?
Yes.
Jim Grant is a veteran Wall Street observer. Has this damaged the stock exchange reputation?
The stock exchange, with this revelation, has become a symbol, I think, of greed.
Take 4,000 trade at 90.
The stock exchange is, in fact, a private enterprise owned by some 1,300 individuals and companies who have seats on the exchange. But even many of those members were stunned to learn the size of Grasso's pay package. We had no idea, one told me, that we had a fox in the chicken coop.
SEC Chairman Bill Donaldson, Grasso's predecessor, said in a pointed letter to the exchange, Grasso's pay package raises serious questions about the NYSE's governance structure. Many of the board members who approved Grasso's pay are CEOs of companies he was charged with regulating.
And what he's done here is he has followed the worst examples of corporate abuse.
After the nation's 3 largest pension funds called for Grasso's resignation, the board called an emergency meeting, and late this afternoon, under pressure, Grasso stepped down. Grasso ran the big board for 8 years and even led calls for corporate reform after the wave of scandals, but he seriously underestimated the outrage his own pay package would provoke. Dick Grasso may keep the $140 million, but he has now lost his job. Dan?
Anthony Mason, who was on Wall Street earlier but is now in Los Angeles, thanks. Coming up next here on the CBS Evening News, Kobe Bryant's lawyers go negative on his accuser. Will or will not that defense offend the jury? Police in Vail, Colorado are resisting a subpoena from lawyers for basketball star and now accused rapist Kobe Bryant, seeking 911 phone records from the night Bryant allegedly raped a young woman at a Vail hotel. As Bill Whitaker reports, this move illustrates the Bryant legal team's belief that the best defense is a tough and bruising offense against Bryant's accuser.
Kobe Bryant has been in nasty fights before, but nothing like he faces in a Colorado courtroom.
He absolutely is fighting for his life. He's fighting for his career. He's fighting for the chance to see his kid before his kid becomes an adult, because you're looking at 10, 15, 20 years in jail if he's convicted.
But before Bryant goes on trial, his attorneys are making clear they intend to put his accuser's credibility on trial. To that end, they've subpoenaed her medical records, looking for mental health problems. Police once called her a danger to herself. They've also subpoenaed police 911 calls, a woman's crisis hotline she may have called, records at her fitness club, and they even want the alleged victim herself to testify at the preliminary hearing.
What they need to find is whether or not there's anything in her past or present which may show that she is someone who's not likely to tell the truth or someone who has an agenda and may want to convict somebody who's in fact innocent.
But the aggressive defense strategy is a risky one. Kobe Bryant's attorneys have to walk a fine line to convince the jury they're just attacking his accuser's credibility. If they push her too hard, they could make the jury feel sympathy for her. It could backfire.
It absolutely could backfire.
Karen Steinhauser formerly prosecuted sex crimes.
People have to wonder why, knowing what's coming, would someone go through this process if it wasn't true? And if I were the prosecutor, that's what I would make jurors think about.
Still, the defense team's aggressive tactics are sending a clear message to Bryant's accuser. They'll sacrifice her to save him. It's the best defense money can buy. Bill Whitaker, CBS News, Eagle, Colorado.
Coming up next here on the CBS Evening News, we'll try to give you a feel for what it would be like to be inside, to actually go face to face with the powerful winds of a hurricane. People along the East Coast are wisely making sure there's plenty of protection between them and the coming potent winds of Hurricane Isabel. If you have any thought of sometimes going out in a hurricane, we'll check out our final report tonight from CBS's Wind Master David Martin.
So this is what's going to keep me from becoming a piece of flying debris? Well, we hope so.
Going into the wind tunnel at Virginia Tech is a safe way to experience hurricane-force winds which can literally blow you away.
Okay, we're all ready. Let's start it up. This is only 30 miles per hour. You don't even start to become a hurricane until you get to 74 miles an hour. Okay, 40 miles an hour. I can still walk around, but I think the only reason you can hear me is that I'm screaming into this microphone. Now that's 50 miles an hour. Okay, let's take it up. Okay, that's 60 miles an hour. Still not hurricane speed. It's getting difficult. I can just barely walk forward. Okay, let's take it up. 70 miles per hour. So that's it. You're out in a 70 mile an hour wind, and there's nothing you can do except hang on to something. Now that's 80 miles an hour. Now we're a Category 1 hurricane. Now I'm totally dependent on this harness. If that weren't holding me here, I'd be back there somewhere. That's 90 miles an hour. That's still just a Category 1 hurricane. This is starting to get pretty darn unpleasant. Okay, that's 100. I can't walk forward. I can't put my foot up. Okay, let's try 10 more. That's 110 miles an hour. Now that is a Category 2 hurricane. Believe me, you don't want to be out there. It feels like the wind is pressing the skin right off your face. The great advantage of being in a wind tunnel, of course, is that you can tell them when to turn it off, and you can't do that in a hurricane. This is David Martin at Virginia Tech in the wind tunnel.
Interesting line of work David does. That's part of our world. I'll be back later tonight with what we think is a particularly good 60 Minutes too. They were shot down by the Iraqis.
We got caught.
The story of their capture and freedom tonight on 60 Minutes 2.
Then a 48 hours mystery. Who murdered Mary's family? 20 years later, she and her grandson still fear the killer. Will new evidence finally solve this crime?
And stay with this CBS station for the very latest on the hurricane. For the CBS Evening News, Dan Rather reporting. See you again soon on 62.
For news 24 hours a day, log on to cbsnews.com.
This is CBS.